Welcome back to the shop. I'm Kirk Anderson. Now in this week's video, I'll be making a drawer for the TV stand I made a few weeks ago. And I'll be using hand-cut dovetails for this drawer. Now I'll be making the box of the drawer out of 1/2 inch Baltic birch plywood. Now this is my first time ever making hand-cut dovetails, and using plywood was probably not the best choice in this. But with that said, let's get to the table saw to cut the pieces. Now the tools I'm using to cut the dovetails, well, first of all is a saw. This is a Japanese pull saw. Next are marking devices. I have a wheel marking gauge and a marking knife, and of course a pencil. And I'll be cutting the dovetails using a guide from David Barron tools. And to lay out the dovetails, I'll be using a compass. And then of course, to clean out the dovetails, a set of chisels. Now the first thing that I did was lay out the pieces so I'll know which piece goes where. And I numbered each corner, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then the pieces that will receive the pins, I placed a P, and then the pieces that will receive the tails, I put a T on the face. Now the first thing to do is use the wheel marking gauge to mark the depth of the dovetails. Now these are going to be through dovetails, so the depth is the thickness of the boards. And then I use the compass to lay out where the dovetails will be. Now the first boards that I'm going to cut are the tails. And then I just use the square to mark each location. And then it's time to make the cuts. Now for cutting the tails, it's not that imperative that you be right on the line. Now this guide has a magnet on it that brings the saw blade right up to the guide, so it's real easy. The only thing you have to worry about is the depth of cut. Now to clean out the majority of the waste, I'm using a coping saw. Now to cut away the waste on the end piece, it's real easy, just using the saw and cut straight down. Now to remove the waste on the others, it's time to pull out the chisels. When you're using the chisels, you only want to go down halfway, and then flip the board over and go down the rest of the way on the other side. Now it's time to take the board that we cut and mark where the pins will be on the pin board. Now once the boards are set up, just a matter of using a marking knife to make the marks. Now, it is definitely more important to really pay attention to the marks when you're cutting the pins. You want to make sure that the entire blade of the saw is on the waste side of the mark. And I'm constantly checking to make sure I don't go past the line of the depth. And then it's over to the next mark and cut that one. Now once all of them are done, there again, I use the coping saw to remove the majority of the waste, and then it's to the chisel to remove the rest of the waste. Now being that this was my very first time cutting dovetails by hand, I had to do a little tweaking with a file. And a test fit, and it fit very tightly. It was actually maybe a little bit too tight, but I'll take too tight over too loose anytime. Now I'm gluing it up, just put a little glue on the pins and the tails. And then put the pieces together. Now, once the glue was put on there, the joint became even tighter. So, needed a little bit of persuasion to get it down in there. Now, to ensure that the corner stays at a perfect 90 degrees, I clamped a speed square into the corner until the glue sets. Then once the other side was put in, now it's just a matter of putting the last piece in. Again, glued the pins and the tails, slide the piece in, and again, it needs a little bit of persuasion to get in there nice and tight. And then I sanded all the surfaces inside and out. I started out with 80 grit, then 120, 180, and then ended up with 220. And being that this was my first time ever cutting dovetails by hand, I did have some few gaps, and I filled those in with sawdust and glue. Now, the bottom of the drawer is also going to be from 1/2 inch Baltic birch plywood. And the bottom is going to be recessed into the drawer box. And the first thing to do that is, with the dado blade in the table saw, is make rabbets on all sides. Now the bottom is just going to be glued in. I put a good amount of glue on the rabbet of the bottom itself, and then on the edges of the box, and then clamped it nice and tight. Now that should be enough clamps to hold it secure till the glue sets. Now I did cut the bottom oversized on purpose, and to get rid of that overhang, I just used a router with the flush trimming bit to flush it all out. Now the drawer front itself is going to be made out of the same 3/4 inch walnut plywood I made the stand out of. Once I cut the drawer front to size, I'm giving it the same treatment I gave the stand, and I'm rounding over the edges with a bullnose bit at the router table. Once the edges were all round over, it's time for some sanding. Again, I started out with 80 grit, then 120, 180, and ended up with 220. And now it's time to apply the finish. First, I gave everything another good sanding. And then for the finish, I'm using wipe-on poly. I'll be putting a total of 4 coats on and giving it a light sanding in between each coat. Now to install the drawer pulls, I'm using a couple of spacer blocks. The first one is for the height of the drawer pull, and the other one is I want it recessed a little bit, and I'm using another block for that. And once the drawer slide is in place, I used the Vicks bit to pre-drill the hole. And then I hand drove the screw in, that's so I wouldn't strip it or overdrive the screw. Now to install the drawer box itself, I put some spacers on the bottom, that's so the drawer wouldn't slide on the bottom. And I pulled out the drawer a little bit with the drawer slide to the first screw hole. And then again with the Vicks bit, I pre-drilled and then hand drove the screw in. Did that on both sides, pulled the drawer out a little bit more till I got to the next hole, and did the same thing. Now in installing the drawer front, I had already pre-drilled in the drawer front for the drawer pull. And I just lined the drawer front up where I wanted it, and then I drilled through those holes into the drawer box. And that would allow me to attach the drawer pull. And now since the drawer front is semi-attached, it allows me to pre-drill in the drawer box from the back into the drawer front and then drive some screws in. Now that does it for this little project that took a while. Like I said, this is the first time I've ever done hand-cut dovetails, and this one drawer took me longer than any drawer I've ever made in my life. but I think it came out pretty good, and I sure did learn a lot doing this, and it'll be easier the next time I do hand-cut dovetails. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, give it a like, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And as always, all you woodworkers out there, just get out there and cut some wood.